Hi, this is Dr. Justina Agnieszka Chevalier. I decided to start the Targeted Individual series with that racial purity, nationalism, and a removal from the settlement places and forceful divorcing of couples that are of different nationality, different countries of origins, different racial characteristics, as well as in controversies to some extent differ to the standard of the area. These marriages, and I was one of them, we are at all times struggling most of the time, excuse me, because I'm listening to the music at the same time. We struggle most of the time with approval of persons that promote this standard that is ordinary, which means marrying right after primary school or high school. And therefore, when persons get out of town to college or postgraduate education, travel, or if there are newcomers, or persons go abroad and find a spouse that is in contrasting racial characteristics or of different passport, then that is okay usually only for casual relationship, a hidden one, or in a relationship in which children will be forced out of the supervision of parents, both parents, and assigned, depending on who is more controlling, culture of one of the two of the families. Often also, if area is hostile, children are in school or during visits forced language of grandparents or of one of the parents that creates hatred. And I've seen it in many persons, actually. Many persons reported that to me in many circumstances. Profound hatred for a opposite, especially gender parent, because vocabulary, especially intimate, applying to body parts vocabulary, was forced in youth as a learning culture, and it would end in many schools in demands of children to stop speaking or mimicking the parent. And children would refuse for a long time speaking and using that language, and felt profound disgust and contempt to cooing and using vocabulary related to genitals, sexuality, and tenderness. All those things were actually then distorted and presented as racial purity programming. And that racial purity programming manifested in policies, for instance, policy that would forbid using national language were simply sometimes normatization of what children and parents would prefer. The attacks on multicultural and multiracial marriages would consist of non-stop sexual harassment to separate couples, impeding pursuit of sexual acts, group stalking of housing, pushing out of houses and accommodations, and forcing non-stop in rumors persons, be it known or unknown, from childhood based on same characteristics as self, and if rejected, accusations of disloyalty, spying, and intents on assassination, robbery of documents, forcing out of income, as well as remote and in-person whore bashing of persons who pursued someone who was not approved by parents and who was not, for instance, pursuing college education. And that again resulted later on, when those were bordering areas, in the rules and regulations in those areas on language used, as well as on language of education, and certain things that were matching, in fact, in defense of those multiracial families, tolerance of persons, so that persons do not turn against own family while wishing to speak own preferred language to own children on own terms. Because that was the problem, that was enforcing what standard is in country of origin or in own culture, and placing in accusations that the person does not match up with that, and so neither of those does this. So apart from neither of persons do. So apart from that, the other person usually was to force out of own place that person, and so persons in Poland during Second and First World War would go back to the country. And many women afterwards made pregnant also, were forced by violence, run out of those places. And so women would come back pregnant with children, and then accused of being harassed or harmed. And because it was a life threat to admit that that husband actually sometimes was a good one, those women would lie and say, yes, the spouse was horrid, he was horrid. It was a threat. The threat was composed and is still at times as, if you form a praise of that person, then that person will be hurt or someone will intend a homicide, as well as if it is not the case, to impede that a person of contrasting racial characteristics, to impose on you love based on pity, will be either killed or harmed. And so that was what then would become, you cannot say anything good about the father of your child, because if you do say something good about the father of your child, that means that you are discriminating or you are cruel towards whoever was killed or harmed, you see. And so that's how the fake reputation started to become later on reality. Of course, yes, there were unwanted racial purity programs and imposing or forbidding languages, and they still are in some places of the world. However, the origins of that, again, in programming are actually much different, as I've explained, than you think. Why and how to recognize it? Well, if you receive a woman who was a fluent native language speaker of yours and refuses adamantly to use that language or has impediments and cannot use that language, that signifies that that woman was in relationship or in love with someone while an active pursuit was made to force out the language of that spouse and impose the language of the parents on her and on children, to impede sexual activity presenting her as someone else in that vocabulary, or to impede at all pursuit of children. And so the same is done for men. And women then, in disgust, actually, and blaming it on lack of knowledge, we refuse to speak own language. And that is to the degree of forcefulness of the vocabulary of grandmother, grandparent, or someone else, to impede not only personal but also work relationships, and force also the culture as an excuse to have others harm or kill, and do that as the other ones fuel it, accusing of disloyalty. So what happened when those women arrived from Germany? You see, a man who, as I mentioned, who wants to have children back in Germany and gave them their education and last name, well, a love's name from the standpoint of behavior, and I am behavior expert, wherever it is or whatever it is that you think about my education, the incapacity to tolerate an offspring of a person or physically side and that person in disgust is proportional to enforcing sex, physical contact with that person, while and someone else is loved, in disregard if that person is only remembered as most loved, or that person is pursued, and in disregard of sexuality at all, in fact. And so the proportion to pursuit and forcing love or sex based on national characteristics or racial characteristics, called national purity, results in self-defense, choosing not to speak own language, and then having children actually sent to the country, to the origin, if there's pregnancy, of the father, to acquire schooling, language, and pretty much everything that is possible that can manifest love of those parents. And then those children come also to Poland from Germany and do look differently or dress differently or have a struggle at the beginning in school and seem superior because of what those couples we are put through, starting from stolen wallets, pushing out of housing, and overt attacks, in fact, during visits of horny idiots from kindergarten or next door neighbors. When persons then glorify in churches family values in complete disregard of how universe and world change and how people travel, and even though there were persons who traveled, most of the time person who married the first person they met, wantingly so, cannot